This video builds upon my Getting Started with Frosty Editor video and introduces some useful tips for using the editor more effectively. First of all is advanced searching. The search bar in Frosty Editor actually supports some additional syntax which can help you to find what you need more easily. You can use the keywords type, contains, starts with, and ends with, followed by a colon and a search term to narrow down your search. The default search works the same way as the contains keyword does. For example, searching for faith is the same thing as searching for contains faith. The starts with and ends with keywords are fairly self-explanatory. The type keyword filters by the asset type. For example, type texture asset would filter out everything but the texture assets in the game. You can combine these keywords with the and or operators. For example, to search for all of the textures with faith in the name, you would write type texture asset and contains faith. It's worth noting that the search is case insensitive, so capitalization doesn't matter. So tip number 2, you may have noticed if working with blueprints, a lot of these values which begin with 0x. For example, these property connection field IDs. These are essentially strings that have been hashed and are represented as hexadecimal values. Fortunately, we can actually resolve a lot of these hashes so that they display their original strings. You can put a strings.txt file in your Frosty Editor folder, which contains a list of known strings, and Frosty will automatically resolve any hashes it can based on the strings on this file. I obviously already have a strings.txt file, and I'll provide a link to download this for anyone that wants to use it. All you need to do is put the file in your Frosty Editor folder. Then we have to close and reopen the Frosty Editor for our changes to take effect. Now you can see that a lot of these hashes have actually been resolved. Not all hashes will be resolved, but a lot of them will be, and it helps a ton with understanding blueprints. Do know though that it is possible for two strings to hash to the same value, which means that a hash could incorrectly be resolved to the wrong string. Usually though this would be obvious, as the string probably wouldn't make sense where it's used. The next useful feature Frosty has that I want to show off is the References tab. If you select the References tab and then select an asset in the Data Explorer, you can see all of the assets that reference the selected asset and all of the assets the selected asset references. This is really useful for finding related parts of a system. For example, we're looking at this UI menu root widget, and we can see it references a bunch of other assets and is referenced in this one in-game menu UI logic file. If we right-click on that, we can either open the asset or find it in the Data Explorer. If we select Find in the Data Explorer, it'll highlight it for us, and then that will show us the references for that asset. So then we can go one step further and look at this UI logic blueprint, and you can see this is kind of the core UI logic file, as it references pretty much all of the other UI logic blueprints in here, such as the HUD and the map. The references will only get you so far though, as they only tell you what assets reference each other. What if you wanted to know specifically where inside an asset another asset is referenced? Frosty does have a filter at the top of the asset window, but you can see if I try and search for in-game menu UI logic, which is the asset we came here from, it doesn't find anything. This is kind of just a limitation of Frosty and how the search filter works. There is a way we can figure this out, and this is where having an XML dump can come in handy. If you click on Tools at the top, you should see an option that says Export EBX to XML. Click on that and it will ask you to choose a location to export the XML files to. Make sure you have enough space for it. For Catalyst, it takes up about 2 gigabytes of space. I've already done this though before, so I'm not actually going to do it right now, as it does take quite a while to export everything. Once the export is finished, open up the folder and you can take a look at the files it created. This is basically all of the assets you can access inside of Frosty, but as XML files. You can also right-click an asset inside the Data Explorer, click Export, and then choose XML as the file type to export just a single asset as XML. So let's take a look at that UI logic asset we just exported. I'm using a program called Visual Studio Code to view this, by the way. It's free and it has some nice syntax highlighting, as you can see, which makes this data a lot easier to read. As you can see, we have these property connections at the top, and if we expand those in Frosty, you can see it's basically the same data, just in text format, which means we can search for things in this file. So if I search for that in-game menu UI logic asset again, we find it right away. If I then search for the GUID of this object, then we can see, first of all, the connections to it, these event connections, for example, but also the index of this object inside of the objects array. So this is index 16. If I go back into Frosty and go to objects 16, you can see we have our in-game menu UI logic asset. Now that might seem like it was a lot of work, but once you get used to it, it can actually save you a lot of time searching, especially in larger files. Having an XML dump is also especially useful for finding examples of how certain entities are used if you're working with blueprint logic. I'll have a separate tutorial for blueprint modding, but this mindset of learning from examples is really good to learn about now regardless. So let's say you wanted to figure out how these math entities work. There's one right here in this blueprint, and if we open it up, it doesn't really make much sense as we're looking at it. We've got these opcodes and a bunch of random numbers in here. I also don't know what the input and output properties are for this object. What I can do is search my entire XML dump, or just part of it, for other uses of math entities to try to better understand how they work. For this, I use a tool called File Locator. It has a light version which is free and does basically all we need. All we need to do is to select the XML dump as our place to look in, which I already have set up here, then enter some text to search for inside the files. So we're searching for math entity data, then click Start. And it's already found a bunch of examples for me, so I'm just going to stop it early. I will say it's worth having your XML dump on an SSD for this, otherwise it could take a while. Let's open one of these files then and take a look. I'm just going to Control F in this file and look for math entities. Now we can see we have this math entity which takes a velocity as an input and then outputs something from this out value. And then we can see our math entity, which has a bunch of instructions in it. Looks to me like this is getting the vertical component of the velocity. I'll actually have another video going over math entities specifically, as they're fairly complicated. But you can see how this is a really useful way to find examples of how entities are used. We can also use this to figure out how these entities are connected. If we go back to those property connections, we can see that the output of this math entity goes to the A input of this compare float entity. If we then search for that entity's GUID, we can learn more about it. You can see that the entity has the A and B properties, where A is 0 and B is -5. Though as we saw before, A is actually provided by that property connection. If we have a look at the event connections, you can see that there's this event coming from the float entity data that is triggered on this A is less than B event. Now it doesn't matter if you don't really understand what property or event connections are at the moment, I'll have another video on those. Basically, we just figured out that when some velocity value is less than -5, this event will be fired. More importantly, we now know some of the input and output properties that these entities support. The last feature I want to cover is one of my favorite new features of version 1.0.6 of the Frosty Editor. In the Frosty Editor folder, you need a mods folder with a folder that's got the same name as your game, so Mirror's Edge Catalyst. And in here, you can put published mod files and they will be applied alongside the mods you make in the editor when you launch it. So this is really useful for testing compatibility with existing mods, but my favorite advantage of this feature is to put the no startup video mod in here. Since you're going to be launching the game a lot of times from the Frosty Editor, having this mod in here saves you a ton of time because you get to skip the intro video every time you launch the game. So if I click launch now, you can see it skipped the little logo intro that it does. Anyway, that's all I wanted to cover in this video. Thanks for watching.